Swiss Finance and Technology Association. We are very honored tonight to be hosting our guests from the Abu Dhabi Global Market. I will introduce them both in just a moment. I wanted to say just a very few brief words about why we're here tonight. Switzerland is a vibrant international fintech hub, and for us a really important part of that is not just the inbound interest, but also the outbound interest. And it's important to work with other fintech hubs on where they have particular strengths, where they can work with the opportunities we have here. So it really is, I call it International Trade 101. It's about focusing on where you have your advantages and working with other partners. And as we'll hear, I think, through both of our speakers tonight, Abu Dhabi is really one of those cases that's quite unique around the world, where you have the type of opportunity for Switzerland to really develop that type of symbiotic relationship. I'm not probably the best person to tell you exactly why, but what I just gathered really from a quick look at it, it has a lot to do with the regional hub status that you see in both locations. Switzerland's this Western European hub. Abu Dhabi is a really strong financial hub for the whole of the Middle East and North African region. The second point is that they're major sources of capital. They almost have a problem with too much capital. So where are they going to find great opportunities to invest in companies of the future? And family offices, for example, another common feature to both of those. We were saying in the discussion as well, there's also this nice mix of overlapping industry focus. And you see a lot of the traditional things in wealth management and insurance, but then you have some things people might not recognize every day, like responsible investing. So in Abu Dhabi, you have a strong focus on Islamic finance and ESG. And of course, here in Switzerland, there's a strong history of philanthropy, microfinance, topics like that. So actually, as you start to look into the two, there's great reasons to consider the markets. What I also think is really interesting to note is how are different regulators and different financial centers adapting to the questions like fintech. RegTech is a big topic. We'll hear a lot about that tonight, and I think it's really important here in Switzerland for us to be aware of what's going on in other parts of the world, so that we can really adapt that and make sure that we're bringing the best solutions to the world here in Switzerland. I really don't want to dwell too much. I didn't bring fancy slides tonight. I really wanted to focus on our guests. I did want to mention briefly a few things that we have going on through the association. For the entrepreneurs and through some of the corporate representatives in the room, you might be interested on Thursday. We're hosting an event with Switzerland Global Enterprise looking at Singapore FinTech Festival. The idea there is we have a Swiss pavilion, including the government, a whole collection of large corporates and small fintech companies that are going to represent the country in the middle of this huge regional event. So Thursday is designed to be an info session all about that. And the other one, very important to mention, is our flagship event. It's back for the third year. It's called Swiss FinTech Pitch, and it's on October 11th. It's open not only to startups, investors, and folks like that. It's actually going to be a great show. It'll be turned into almost like a Dragon's Den style video at the end, and it's at the Landesmuseum, so really historic, great venue as well. So if you have any interest, we can talk about it afterwards. I'm going to keep it short and leave plenty of time for questions about our guest this evening. I think first I want to introduce Steve Barnett. I'll not ruin the introduction. Why don't you join us up here on stage and say a few words about your background.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everybody out there. Thomas and I are going to try and keep this relatively short in terms of the formal bit of this evening, because one of the philosophies of Abu Dhabi Global Market from inception has been that we should try and build things which respond to people's needs. So I think if we're going to pursue that theme, we should be doing that this evening as well, and focus more on answering your questions about what we're doing, answering your questions about our region, however you want to play that. Things that are of interest to you are things that we'll focus on. So I'm going to do the relatively boring bit at the start and tell you a little bit about Abu Dhabi Global Market generally, and then I'm going to hand over to Thomas, who'll take us through the overview of what we're doing around fintech. And then, as I say, our idea is that we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A so that we can actually focus on the things that are of most interest to you. Can we take that down slide? So just a few brief things on Abu Dhabi Global Market. We are, technically speaking, a financial free zone. What that means is that we have no restrictions on foreign ownership. You can have an international firm or an international individual can own 100% of the business. We have no requirement for local employment. We have 0% tax, direct tax for 50 years, and the civil and commercial laws of the UAE do not apply. And so in building a financial centre in the capital of the UAE, one of the things we've had to focus on is building a legal and regulatory framework that responds to people's needs. When we started out, people asked us really for two things, and our approach has been very much, let's go ask people what they want and see what the best way is of delivering that. The first thing people asked us for is give us a strong rule of law. And when we pushed a little bit on that and said, okay, specifically, what do you want us to do? They gave us a few things. One is they said, please, we want an English common law jurisdiction, and we want that to be, we want it to be a native English common law jurisdiction. So what we've done is, for the first time in the region, to adopt English common law directly as the basis of our legal system. What they wanted was a strong regulatory framework which was internationally consistent but easy to access. So we put in place something that enabled us to sign up to the IOSCO MMOU extremely quickly. We're in the process of trying to do that with ESMA as well. Process going extremely well. The framework we're very comfortable is internationally consistent. We've spent a lot of time trying to ungold plate that regulatory environment to make it easy for people to access. Fascinating for me, I was speaking at an event in London around global expansion and Brexit a little while ago, and you've got three people on a panel. You've got a guy from the US, a guy from the EU, and a guy from the UK, and they were all sort of shouting at each other about, the guy from the EU was saying, trouble is we produce a piece of regulation and then you Brits go and add to it and gold plate it. The British guy was saying, you really feel that you can say that to us, the way the EU lays layer upon layer of regulation? And the American guy said, yeah, you Europeans, you're terrible at this. And the two guys looked at him and said, you really? You feel you can say this from a US perspective? So one of the things that we've tried to do is to give things which are internationally consistent but strip them down so that they are focused on the risks of doing business. And that echoes, I think, into what Thomas will talk about in terms of our approach to fintech. Yeah, Abu Dhabi is by any measure a centre of wealth. We have more than $1 trillion of wealth invested around the world. As John said, we have two of the 5 largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. We have a GDP per capita that's close to $100,000 still, even with oil at the price it is now. So we're starting from a platform of a very strong place to build a regional financial centre. And so far, we launched for business in 2015, October 2015. We've registered more than 400 companies. We've issued 39 financial services licenses. We've got 15 funds there, around $4 billion of AUM. We've had a whole number of firsts. Not only the first time to directly apply English common law as the basis of the legal system, but firsts around things like first aircraft financing regime in the region, the first foundations regime in the region, the first private REIT regime in the region, and many other things, the first regulatory sandbox. And that is probably the point at which I'll stop talking and hand over to Thomas, and I'll happily come back in later and tell you more about ADGM, Abu Dhabi, and the broader region if you wish.
Thanks, it's a pleasure to be here. Actually, after 2 years, I left Switzerland 2 years ago. I worked for, as many of you know, for FINMA before, so I'm very familiar, if you want, with the financial markets here in Switzerland and the nascent and very vibrant fintech scene. So I went to Abu Dhabi 2 years ago to actually accept the challenge that was presented to head up the banking and insurance side, authorization and supervision in the ADGM, Abu Dhabi Global Markets, the financial center Steve just so eloquently presented to us.
Don't laugh at that, please.
So what I would like to cover really is, and I think that's why most of you are here, what makes Abu Dhabi a destination for fintech, all right? Why is this on the map? I think first of all, I would mention, people in Abu Dhabi or in the UAE generally are very tech savvy, generally speaking. I think I was surprised moving there how many government services you can do online, how many things you can pay online, how much the acceptance rate of fintech or of the technology generally the people have over there. So I think it's a good sort of fundamental acceptance of everything that's to do with technology. Second, the mobile phone penetration. I think, Steve, you mentioned that 1.9 mobile phones per person in the UAE. So you have a lot of people, actually, many people, and I'll cover that as well, they don't have bank accounts they're migrant workers, but they all have 1 or 2 phones. And they use the phones. It's actually part of the package they get when they get into the country. So the acceptance, again, there and the usage of the phone certainly helps the establishment of the fintech and financial technology generally. Then as well, there is a growing demand for financial intermediation generally. People are young, and I'm covering the region, not just the UAE. People are young, there's a growing middle class. Some of them, or many of them, are underbanked. They will start to use more financial intermediation products, services. So I think it's the right moment as well to consider this to be one of the areas where you have a lot of growth in the future. 85% of the people in the UAE are unbanked, not just underbanked, unbanked. So I think again, and from the proposals we see in the area and in the area of fintech, mostly or many have to do with payment services. Not very surprising, because a lot of the migrant workers obviously send home a lot of money. Financial inclusion is the topic really here. SME lending is another growth area. The banks in the UAE don't typically lend too much to the smaller spectrum of the SMEs, more to the larger spectrum. And in the smaller end, I think peer-to-peer lenders and very technology-driven offers can actually help to cover that gap. So there's a lot to be done there. So that is the sort of overall condition that makes Abu Dhabi, the UAE, and generally the Middle East a good place to actually invest and then to be present. Now, 2 years ago when I started there, I think people barely spoke about fintech. It just was about to sort of be introduced. The central bank didn't have a lot of regulations out. Not a lot of players were actually on the surface. So we sort of looked at the market there at the time with Steve and the strategy and others. What can we do? What are the points we can differentiate ourselves? And fintech certainly came up. 2 years later, not even, maybe 18 months later, we were selected the fintech hub #1 by, I think it was Deloitte, right? Studied them by Finance. So how did we do that? From scratch in 18 months actually to the fintech hub #1 in the UAE, in the Middle East actually. That's the sort of points I would like to cover. And if you can change the slide, I'll start with our reg lab, our sandbox. I think as a regulator, first and foremost, I think what you need is a regulatory framework to accept and fintechs and to help them, if I may use the term, to get out of the underground to the surface, be regulated and be seen and known by the community, and actually be used by the consumers. So our reg lab caters for a certain number of firms that have a couple of criteria. We had to issue some criteria for the hurdles to get into the reg lab. So you need to be an innovative proposal. You cannot be something that is already there, but you just do it in a slightly new way. It needs to have some element of innovation, of course. And I think very importantly also, your product needs to be testable. It needs to be, the product or service needs to be ready to actually be deployed in a safe environment, possibly with limited scope in terms of the volumes you can produce or the type of clients you can cater to, but you need to be able to test it. We don't want any just ideas or concepts actually in our reg lab, because that's too much work as well for the regulator and doesn't lead you anywhere. So these are the criteria. The features then, once you make it into the reg lab, is it's a 2-year period. So you have 2 years to either get out of the reg lab because you haven't been successful, or you have other ideas, or it's actually not regulated. That can also be the case. Or after the 2-year phase, you get into the fully normal regulated activities. And we will have cases, we're very mindful of that, where we have to adjust our regulation as well. When we get these firms out of the reg lab, maybe not everything, not every angle of our regulation will be fit for purpose. So we're actually happy to adjust the regulations there as well. So we have had 2 cohorts, 2 batches of applicant firms. First was closed in February this year. We admitted 5 fintechs to our sandbox, and the second batch is about to close. We have received over 20 applications, and we're working through these and see how many will make it. So probably ask yourselves what kind of firms make it into the reg lab. Not surprisingly, again, it's around payments. We see that a lot. Financial inclusion plays. We have Automated escrow accounts, that's another area. Automated SME credit assessment is another area, again, sort of leading to the area of the underbanked SME types. And robo-advisory is another one that made it into. Now in the second batch, obviously, the full spectrum is going to be even broader, and we're very keen to see who will make it into the second batch. We can change that one. Now, as a regulator, I guess you cannot really stop there. I mean, one thing is to do a sandbox or a reg lab, but you need to go much further than this. When we started, there wasn't enough ecosystem really around fintech. So we had to do much more things than just create a reg lab. You need to do a partnership with academia. So we signed MOUs with New York University and INSEAD to organize common events, to be on the scene together, to have also the educational side. We did create a venture capital framework. I think most of you in this area know how important and how difficult the funding side at the end is. So what we try to do is cater for a venture capital framework that is more that has reduced regulatory requirements, for example, in terms of capitalization, just to help the venture capitalist markets to grow and to access or to ease the access to funding for the fintechs. We worked very closely with associations, such as obviously John's and the SFTA and other associations around the globe. We also worked very closely with the incumbent players, the banks. We signed MOUs with many of the financial institutions. Seems a bit odd maybe for a regulator to sign an MOU with a financial institution, but I think you have to sometimes have radical ideas. The preparedness of some of the financial institutions in the ADGM or in Abu Dhabi generally didn't go much beyond the fact that fintech actually is the development of a fancy client-facing app. There's much more, and in engaging with the firms, you can see that there's a lot of areas for cooperation, even between the existing firms, the regulators, the investors, etc. We also signed MOUs with accelerators, incubators, etc., to sort of fill the whole ecosystem and make it a lively place. So I think if I compare what ADGM as a regulator does to the sort of more traditional approach regulators take, I think we try to connect people. We try to create and give an impetus to things to happen, and from there hopefully the private sector will take over. It's not our goal or our aim to sort of be orchestrating things, but you have to provide the right framework for things to happen. So that's what we try to do. You can change the slide, please. Looking ahead a little bit, we're about to launch an innovation center. Will probably be announced a little later in this year. Innovation center is actually an interesting thing. I mean, other jurisdictions have tested it. What we did is we worked on problem statements. Financial institutions' problem statements. The sort of the pain points of the financial industry of today. Can be in the area of financial inclusion, can be in the area of data management, cloud, using the cloud, electronic documentation management, etc. So what is adding to the costs in today's financial institutions? What is actually hindering the service of banks to become better for the clients? So we came up with 12 odd problem statements, and we further developed those. And the idea of the innovation center is to crowdsource solutions to these problems. We'll ask and we send around these statements to not only the UAE-based fintechs, but actually globally, for them to participate, to come to the innovation center, which is actually a physical space in the ADGM, to work alongside investors, to work alongside financial institutions, the regulator, to try to develop solutions to these problems. And the ones that make it, the ones that actually are promising, will undergo an acceleration program. We work with a very well-known global accelerator to help them, and hopefully lead into at some point the improvement of the financial services in the UAE. But first and foremost, also it's a very attractive business opportunity, I think, for some of the more innovative fintech players around the globe. So please So I'm coming to an end. Just sort of the journey ahead for us. I think I would really like to announce the Fintech Summit. We have, similar to what Singapore does, we have one a little earlier in the year. It's going to be on the 22nd and 23rd of this coming October. It's going to be 2 days. First day is going to be an innovation challenge, again around the same sort of problem statements. We have received 166 answers from fintechs around the world, and they will present the 11 best of them. Actually, we had gone over all of these, and with some help of external consulting as well, selected 11 fintech players, very, very global, but also regional and local, to present at the demo day, which is the first day of our Fintech Summit on the 22nd. The 23rd, obviously, John, you will be there as well, and obviously a lot of other key speakers. I think we have the Chief Fintech Officer from the MAS as well, and we'll be glad to host some of you there and make this event a truly good event. And from there we take it. We have started a lot of things, a lot of good things, hopefully, and it's very interesting sort of see the scene develop there and the responses we get, and the more interest we can get from overseas, the better it is for us. So with that, I think we stop here. And
Can I just summarise one thing on the Reg Lab? For me, the philosophy of this has been that our role as regulators is to stimulate innovation and to foster innovation. It's not to prevent it from happening. And I think that there's a real risk that regulators stifle innovation. So our approach has been to say we start with pretty much a zero-based regulatory approach. We look at regulating each of the participants in the Reg Lab on a bespoke basis. So the idea is that if you come with somebody who's innovative and you try to shoehorn them into a traditional regulatory structure, it won't work. So let's take them, let's start with the zero base, let's look at the things that we need to apply specifically for that institution in order for it to, as Thomas said, to test, to challenge, to develop its product until it's mature. And then they work alongside us as a regulator, because we recognize that our regulation will need to evolve as well as the product needing to evolve. So the two things move in lockstep. And in that way, we think we can best foster that innovation and growth in the fintech space. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we're trying to get to with the overall thing. That's the philosophy behind it. So with that, rather than us tell you things that may not be what you wanted to know from us, we thought we'd stop and invite you to ask the things that you did want to know from us. Then perhaps
and we haven't covered. Yeah.
Raphael, do you need to use the microphone, or you can probably hear, I think, right? Yeah, this is loud enough. Questions off the bat? Anyone want to start? Philip.
I spent part of the time in Dubai. I know the region, Abu Dhabi.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of close to a little bit of the fintech space. I'm pleasantly surprised that a growing number of the startups are from female entrepreneurs.
Absolutely.
Which is surprising when you think of the Middle East. You don't think a lot of this business is started by women. What's your experience in that area?
So it's interesting you say that. I was in San Francisco about 6 months ago. We did a roundtable in San Francisco. And I had a lady from one of the inclusion bodies in San Francisco who was saying, look, the trouble with the Middle East is that you don't have proper representation of women. And so I went through and talked about our own organisation. She said, so what have you got in your organisation? So I said, well, we have 3 chief executives, one of them's a woman. If you look at our senior manager group, we have about 40% of them are women. If we then look at the UAE as a whole, and you look at the number of female ministers we have in the UAE, we actually compare rather well with the US. And so I think it's actually, and she looked at us and said, okay, actually you're probably doing better than we are in many respects. So I'm not as surprised as you are that we've got so many women that are driving innovation, because I think that in many ways the future for the UAE lies with its women. So one of the things that we see, it's a challenge to motivate people that are coming through as next gen people, where they've come from very successful entrepreneurs into that second generation who've taken and consolidated wealth. The next gen, I'm sure we've all seen it, that typically are the ones that we expect to lose that money. but you've got that sort of that degree of entitlement, which the UAE I think is working very hard to overcome. But that degree of entitlement does not exist in its women. And I find the women are the most driven, they're often the best educated because they've really pushed the boundaries. They know they've got to work harder, and they do. So I think in many respects, it's the future of the UAE. So I'm not at all surprised to see what you've just described.
I was a bit surprised, but then again, it's also, it's the case everywhere where you go. Normally the women take the most important financial decisions in life. And that's no different there. But no, joke aside, I think it's. I was surprised as well. But I'm also, I've 2 years less obviously than Steve, because you have an imagination of maybe a society in the UAE that is a little closed and that's man-driven completely. There are some aspects to that, but in social life, but also in the economic life, more and more women play a pivotal role, and we see that also at our workplace. Actually, well-educated, hard workers, and it's encouraging to see actually.
How do you convince a company that the market is big enough for it to go to United Arab Emirates? Because obviously it's not an open door to go to the other Gulf countries.
No, it isn't.
What kind of conversations do you have with companies about the potential of the local market?
Well, I think it is more than the local market, because although you don't have an EU-type passporting structure, we do actually have a lot of people that want to do business in the region, but want to do it outside their domestic location. So, sitting on the side of the massive market, which is Saudi Arabia, you see a lot of people that want to keep business opportunities that they've previously done all around the world, to keep them in the region if they have the chance. And so we're finding that building something in the region has encouraged people to do things here. So, when we started building the financial centre, we said, we recognise that for things like funds, people have come to Luxembourg and other such places. So we've built a funds regime which will give people the opportunity, not the need, but the opportunity to do that in the region still. And you can have international investors doing that. We looked at things like inheritance structures. A lot of people would go to places like the Channel Islands to do inheritance trusts. You can do those in ADGM now. Even to the extent of things like SPVs, where most of the people in the region have gone to Cayman Islands BVI. Since we launched our SPV regime, which is every bit as cheap, as quick, as flexible, and it doesn't have the same OECD transparency challenges as the Cayman structure. Since we launched that in January, we've done a little over 130 of them in that short space of time. So we've got firms that have come to us because they're interested in doing business right throughout our time zone. So we've got people that are looking to do business in sub-Saharan Africa from ADGM. We've got Kazakhstan-based organisations that are looking to use ADGM as a home for looking at the former Soviet Union, the western side of that. We've got people that are looking at business into Pakistan and India. So it's not just the domestic market. So I think we're sitting at a fast-growing region where the middle classes are growing rapidly, and it's not as easy as we'd like for you to access those directly, but it's becoming easier and easier. And I think if we can continue to push the product, continue to push the innovation, and continue to push the ease of doing business, people will overcome those challenges in order to stay in region.
Maybe if I can follow up on your question, another regulatory question, if I may. What's your regulatory approach? One could think, okay, I'm building now a breeding ground for the region, or I'm building a breeding ground also for the global economy, so that as these businesses mature, it's for them easier to tap into the US and, for example, into the EU. Is that a rationale? That would be the first question. The second question is, you talked about venture capital. What is the quality of venture capital in the region? Are you trying to pull in large-scale investors from Silicon Valley, for example, also to increase quality of venture capital and also to increase the chances of some of these businesses to grow and to survive?
I can start from the venture capital side. Well, I think it's a bit of both. Certainly we have been created to be both three times regional, local, and international. So we certainly would attract international venture capitalist fund from establishment. The big funds, obviously, if there's an interest, more than happy to certainly welcome those. But I think it's also to help help the sort of more regional and local fund managers, right, to establish, because there's a lot of funding available, and a lot of the funding today from the UAE and the region generally is invested outside, or there is high regulatory requirements when it comes to ease of the requirements for sophisticated investors, right? That's just not the case. A venture capitalist obviously is working with sophisticated clients, and in the region and many parts in the world, you still find very, very high regulatory requirements. So by lowering those with criteria, of course, we think that we can. There's some overall size limits of the funds, etc. So we do some regulatory, boundaries and safeguards against it. But by lowering these standards in terms of the capitalization needed, we do think that there is going to be a nascent also local and regional venture capitalist scene emerging that will help hopefully the fintechs, but not only the fintechs, the startups more broadly to get access to capital.
Yeah, let me build on that. I think that when we started this, we looked at benchmarks around the world. And obviously you go to Silicon Valley as being a good example of places that innovation really flourished. You say, well, why does it flourish? And one of the main reasons, in my view, that Silicon Valley has become what it is the availability of venture capital. It's not just the availability of technological sophistication. That exists all around the world. It's actually the venture capital which I think has been one of the key differentiators. In our region, I think we've got, by looking at family structures, family offices, private investors, you've perhaps got more propensity to take risk than you have if you're looking at more corporate types of investors. What we were lacking was a framework which enabled them to do that in in a well-regulated environment. So putting the venture capital framework in place is a catalyst to doing that. Having said that, since we did it, we've had quite a lot of approach from international venture capitalists who are interested in taking advantage of it because they see assets that they think are going to be interesting. So it isn't just applying it to fintech, it's applying it to other asset classes as well. We don't limit the venture capital to fintech. In terms of the broader regulatory environment, you talked about our regulatory philosophy, I guess I'd start from the perspective of saying that the key for us is that we have to be considered to be equivalent from a regulatory point of view to other jurisdictions around the world. If you can do that, then you put people in a position where, yes, they can incubate in our region, but then they can develop into others. One of the things that we haven't talked about is the Fintech Bridges that we've built. So we built a Fintech Bridge. First one was with Singapore, we've done Japan, we've done Australia, we've done Kenya. We're in the process of inking others. And part of the rationale for that is that it gives you a situation where you can effectively agree green lanes for people that have been regulated initially in one of those locations to make the transition into the others. So that sort of connecting regulatory environments in different fintech hubs around the world, I think is going to be critical if you're going to take fintech from being something new to being financial services, which is what I think we all expect it to be in the next 5 years or so. We're not going to be talking about fintech, we're going to be talking about financial services. It's just done a different way.
Great question. Daniel, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you still have one or no? Oh, pardon me, sorry.
Yeah, I had one. Where do you see the main differences between Abu Dhabi Fintech Hub and the other Fintech hubs?
I can start on that one, yeah. I think certainly the first was the sandbox. I think others have followed on that. I think the size of the Reg Lab, and I think there's a difference in the approach as well. And it's probably in the criteria I mentioned where we look at what kind of fintechs are going to be admitted to our sandbox. We rather have a low number of relatively mature startups that can test their products, that can also supervise, and that can also be followed by us and accompanied in their journey, as opposed to when you see that in other in other hubs, sort of hundreds of ideas and concepts floating around. Then you obviously have a lot of ideas, etc. But it's impossible for a regulator, especially at the size of development we are, with only a few people, to actually follow these and to be sure that when we do our blank sheet approach, when it comes to the how many regulatory requirements there are, will need to be given to such a fintech. It's impossible to do that when you have hundreds or dozens of fintechs. You need this to be in a solid way. I think the Innovation Center certainly is something else that we will launch that is going to be a first in the region as well, not in the world, but in the region certainly. I think as well the inclusive approach we take. Steve just mentioned and added on, the fintech MOUs we have, the working with the academia, the working with the financial institutions, the working with associations, and bringing everything together. I think in some other jurisdictions in the region, you see, I think things are often reduced to just some sort of sandbox and some sort of reduced, regulatory requirements for startups. We go much beyond.
So I would build on that. I mean, one of the things we're very excited about the sandbox. We think it's something which is good for firms. It's real. It's tangible. It provides real support. It's not just lip service. It's not just mentoring. But that's not all we do around fintech. I mean, we also do engage with. Thomas and I both sit in the regulator. So Thomas does authorization and supervision, and I do financial center development. So part of the responsibility of my team is to work with people pre-application up to the point where they might be interested in doing business with us, and post-application, so that we continue to evolve our ecosystem, our environment, our regulation, to make sure that they can continue to innovate and do business after they've applied to us. We've got a number of fintech firms that come and talk to us, and we work with them on an ongoing basis that are not yet at the point that they would need to be in order to come into the sandbox. That's fine. We're happy to work with them. We've got people that come straight into a regulated environment. They don't need to go through the sandbox. They've already done their testing and development, and they're now ready and mature to launch fintech-based products. So we see the whole of that as being part of our fintech environment. And is it different? We like to think it's a little different. We like to think the engagement that we get with them is a little different. Frankly, we've got other centres in the region that are also doing things which they're very keen on and works well for them. I think it will work well with the organisations that want to work the way we work. Others will work well with different types of organisations. For me, it's horses and courses. It's the most important thing, and it's a philosophy that we adopt as a regulator throughout, is that we see this as a bit of a partnership. We're as a regulator, our philosophy is putting willing buyers and willing sellers together. It's working together with organisations to make sure that they can do good business in a safe, sound, secure way. It's not a business prevention way, which I think has become the sort of the flavour of some regulators around the world. We're definitely not trying to do that. It's not a compromise on safety and soundness and security. It's a balance.
Another good question. Any final questions? We're just a moment before drink hour, but Dominic, quickly, and then maybe we'll find time for. Actually, we've got two more here. So Dominic first. Yeah.
How do you accompany firms in the sandbox during those 2 years?
How the firms?
Yeah.
Well, they get a lot of assistance first when they come in. All the sort of administrative hurdles that sometimes are linked to the establishment in ADGM, they can enjoy as well. That's a help with visa, and that's a help with, for example, co-working space, office space generally. How to set up. That's sort of something that's done. Then I guess the regulatory regime that's applicable to them. Steve mentioned it. We are start with a blank sheet approach, right? So when a fintech is admitted, we just go as a regulator and see how much is actually applicable, how much of our regulatory regime needs to be applicable to it. And we start from zero and we add what we think is needed. Now, as these fintechs grow and deploy their products, we may want to adjust. And we see actually they cater to clients that maybe, they may need a little more disclosure because the clients may not understand, or actually less. So we sort of follow them and be sure that we have the regulatory requirements always at the right level. And that's also the reason why I said it's extremely regulatory. It's extremely cumbersome and there's a lot of burden, resource intensive. So whenever Steve from the business development brings hundreds of fintechs, or we obviously try to say, we can just take some. We have to have our sort of hurdles for the admission still relatively high. Again, it needs to be sound, it needs to be innovative, it needs to be testable, etc. For us to be able to accompany them in the way I just outlined.
The other thing is then that because we've built that ecosystem with partners that deliver different components of that ecosystem, whether it's co-working, whether accelerator, whether it's education, whether it's the financial institutions that are part of the innovation centre, is providing them with the counterparts that they need to work with through that journey so that they can continue to develop and evolve the product. So it's not just us, it's the partners that we have within that environment that we see those people working with. And sometimes it's hard for people. I mean, we found that in some other centres, because fintechs quite often want to work with an established player in the market to commercialize, to test, to partner in terms of clients, whatever it is, they want to work with an established institution. A lot of centres, the market's become a little crowded out. You know, an institution is already working with as many fintechs as they can during their life. Yeah, for us, we make a benefit of something which is perhaps a shortfall. So Abu Dhabi, coming into this, was probably not as sophisticated in terms of financial technology as it's becoming, and therefore we've got a number of institutions that still have capacity to work with fintech startups developing players. So you know, it's a benefit from something which would otherwise be a shortfall, I think.
And do you assess the risks that come along with their business model?
Absolutely. From the beginning. So there may be some restrictions for them to not reach out to retail clients or only to a certain segment of retail clients. There may be some volume restrictions, number of transactions per month or in the first months, volumes, etc. There are some non-negotiable risks. And you know that from your own background. Anti-money laundering, for example, that's something where there's absolutely no compromise. So we look at that for sure. But there are other areas where, you know, where the risk may not be that elevated for a company in the first place not to have a finance officer, but the finance function being done by you know, somebody who's there because it's very small, etc. But otherwise, it would be a requirement, a regulatory. But for that risk, we won't ask for it. So.
And when we talk about zero-based regulation with bespoke regulation being applied to each individual firm, it's based on the regulations that we apply are based on the risks that we assess within the firms. That's exactly how we go about it.
Did we still have a question on? Yep.
You highlighted the AGM as a free zone.
Yes.
And the way they look up, right? And one example, I got a little bit confused, the one who looks into South Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Now the fintech is situated in your free zone, but doesn't want to look at, but just do or place their products in getting out to the region, to the UAE. How do you handle that?
So it will depend very much what those products are, because it's if your question is, do you have full passporting into the UAE, and you're being very polite about asking it, then the answer is no, we don't have full passporting into the UAE. What we do have is arrangements with the federal regulators around certain product types. Apart from that, those products need to be sold and marketed from and within ADGM. The benefit of doing that from locally, if you want to access the local market, is it's a relatively simple walk across the bridge, where it's you don't have to get on a plane to go and do it. Well, from a regulatory point of view, then if people make that relatively simple walk across the bridge, then you're in our environments, and then there's no prevention on people in the state buying them. There's the prevention from people in the free zone selling them. So there is a difference there.
The food is being served, so we'll take one quick last question from Boris.
It's a quick one.
Yep.
So, Steve, you mentioned an interesting aspect that you have built a regulatory bridge to Kenya. Kenya is probably one of the most advanced markets on mobile, even than a lot of European countries. So, what is your experience of basically exporting business into Kenya versus having basically creativity flowing from Kenya into Abu Dhabi to build new business around mobile?
Well, it's still new, is the honest answer, and I won't try and paint it as something that it's not. But I think that what you've got, because of the innovation that we've seen in Kenya, is that you've got a market which is readily accepting of that innovation. And so, you know, I've seen some fascinating and interesting things. I was in Kenya about 18 months ago on a UAE visit there, part of something associated with the foreign minister's visit to Kenya, and really interesting things like we went to see a development in the Masai Mara. It was a leisure build in the Masai Mara. It was actually at the location that Out of Africa was filmed. You stand there and you look at the advertising poster for Out of Africa. You're standing right there looking out. It's an amazing place. And in order to get that piece of land, the developer had moved the local Maasai tribe 800 meters down the hill. And to encourage them to do that, he built them two things. One is a dam, and the other was a school. In building a school, it meant that the commitment of the Kenyan government was if you have a school, they'll put electricity in there. As soon as they put electricity in there, you could put mobile masts in. As soon as you put mobile masts in, you'd banked a whole community that were previously unbanked. Some really fascinating things to go and see. But yeah, because you've got people that aren't constrained by the traditional way of doing banking business, you've got people that are interested in new ways of doing it. In some ways that makes it easier than coming to a place like Switzerland, going to a place like the UK and saying, why don't you abandon this thing that you've been doing for the last 30 years and do it this way instead? It's a bit like for us, part of the reason that we can do things so quickly in ADGM is we have no legacy. And it's a great advantage because we can do things quickly. If you've got somewhere that's got no legacy in terms of financial structures, they're very accepting of new ideas. So that for me, I think is an interesting one. I think there'll be much more opportunity to export in there than we might otherwise have expected.
And I think it's today easier to transfer money to Kenya than to anywhere else in the world using the mobile phones, right? It's
the global lead market in financial services on the mobile. So.
It's amazing.
Funny, there's a lot of people trying to transfer money out of Nigeria, but that's maybe a different story.
Well, on a high note, thank you so much, both Thomas and Steve. This has been an excellent insight. I think, number one, I think what you learn is there's great opportunities for Swiss fintechs in the Abu Dhabi financial, in the global market. I hope actually next year to see some of the results, and we'll have some of the companies coming back here to Switzerland and introduce them to some of the big corporates here. Along the same lines, I think it's also really interesting to hear about some of the things that you've really pushed ahead on when you were benchmarking and really pushing to be first in the region. We're always constantly looking around and figuring out what we can help with in Switzerland, so great to get a few insights from what you've experienced. And last but not least, I forgot to mention earlier, our big event on October 11th, Swiss Fintech Pitch. Because we appreciated you all coming here so much tonight, we have a 50% discount for all the tickets for that event. So we'd love to see you again in about 2-3 weeks' time. That's it for me. A big round of applause for our guests.
Thanks.